Hey, what is up guys, and welcome back to another Java programming tutorial. And in this tutorial, we are going to be going over a concept called scope. Now, scope is extremely important to understand, especially as you get further and further along into your programming journey as a whole. Now, what is scope? Well, scope is essentially a concept of what can see my methods, my variables, my classes, that kind of stuff. Like basically, scope is the visibility of your stuff in relation to other code. So there are multiple different types of scope. There's the local scope, there's the class level scope, and then there's the global scope, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go through these one by one. First, going for the most broad, which is the global scope. Now, I'm sure that you've heard me mention the static keyword at least once or twice before. The static keyword is important because static will basically allow for your method or your class or your variable to be accessed from anywhere. Quite literally anywhere. Whether it be in a constructor, a method, an if statement, other classes, anywhere. So it can be accessed globally from anywhere within your application. Usually you're going to want to utilize the global scope for specific constants that you're going to be using throughout your application. For example, in Java applications, where you go and access a database, usually you're going to want to have the location of the database, whether it be a remote or local host location. You'll want to have that stored in a constant in your application. The password for your database is a little bit different, but either way, that's one use case for the global scope when it comes to constants. They're also useful. The global scope is also useful for utility functions or utility methods that you're going to be using throughout multiple places in your application. So, for example, let's say you need to hash a password. A utility method that goes through and hashes that password using a specific security hashing algorithm. That would be a good use of a utility method that uses static for the global scope. Right? So that's one thing. Now, what about the class scope? Well, the class scope, it's technically part of a local scope. Usually, you'll hear the global and the local scope being used, and the class scope is usually put into that category. But what you need to know is that anything that is on that is like within a class and doesn't have static applied to it, that's usually only accessible from the class and anything below it. So it would be accessible from within that class in any of the methods that it has. And this is where they typically get lumped in, because you also have a scope for the methods, which is local to only those methods. The local scope usually has different levels, so like class, function, if statements, loops, that kind of stuff. Those are usually referred to as local scopes rather than global, because with local, they're not accessible from everywhere. Right. So a local scope is usually only accessible from within that specific block. So for example, just to kind of give you an example here. So let's go ahead and inside of our main function, we can create a string name, and we'll set it to a value of Gina, right? Now, this is within a local scope, because it can only be accessed from within this specific code block and anything further downwards into the scope. So I can use this inside of any if statements or loops that are inside of this, and any ifs or loops that are inside of those, and so on and so forth. It just keeps going. As long as it's available in a higher scope than the one you're in, you can use it. So that is that's pretty neat. However, let's say we have another method. We'll say public void test, right? This is just a test method. We cannot access the name variable from within this function. Now, why is that? It's because the two methods are on the same scope level, but the variable is within the scope of the main method and not within the scope of the test method. So that's kind of a little bit of a nuance with scope, and what I'll do is I'll leave it up to you guys to experiment with scope so you can understand it even better. Create a bunch of if statements within an if statement, loops within loops, that kind of stuff, to kind of say, oh, so that's how that works, that kind of thing. Because again, if you do it yourself rather than just watch somebody else do it, you're gonna learn something a lot better if you didn't do it yourself. If you didn't do any repetition, that sort of stuff. So that basically does it for this tutorial, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching, and we will see you all in the next one. See ya.